Hey Threadheads, welcome back to the Fur Minds. Darren here. I'm going to take you through a little fly tying tutorial. Today we're going to be tying John Garish's little brown trout. And this is a nice little bucktail pattern. Haven't featured one in quite some time, but I do have its accompanying pattern, the Garish Special. And I'll link to that in the description. I'm also going to add some links in the description for Bob Petty's excellent article on bucktails. And I probably said it before, I'm going to say it again. He's one of the best tyers of bucktails that there is, bar none. I'm also going to link to his contribution to my Streamers 365 project, and you can see the little brown trout that he tied especially for that. John Garish once said, if people don't occasionally walk away from you shaking their heads, you're probably doing something wrong. In this case, I would have to disagree with that because this is one of my favorite bucktail patterns. Don't forget to leave a comment below, and I'll get your name entered into the next draw for some decals and some of the flies that we tie on the channel. All right, let's have a look at the material list and get started. Get a fresh hook in the vise. So for this fly today, there's a number of different streamer hooks you could use, but the one I'm going to be using is the Mustad L87, and this is the modern equivalent of the classic 3665A, which is a really excellent streamer hook with a limerick bend on it. This is a 3 extra heavy, and it's somewhere around 7 extra long. So you had a lot of room to tie a nice, well-proportioned bucktail with this one. We're going to be starting off with some white flat wax nylon. If you don't have that, I would recommend using some sort of flat laying thread, something like a UTC 140 denier or something similar. So we're going to just tie in a little bit behind the eye. We want to leave some space to form our head. And the first material we're going to tie in is about 10 strands of pearl flashabou. And we're going to tie those in along the hook shank. We want to kind of try and keep this thread as flat as possible. So you see I'll stop every once in a while, and I'm going to give the bobbin a little bit of a spin just to unwind any of the thread wind that's accumulated in there. So every time you wind the thread, you're putting like a half turn into it. So we'll just undo that every once in a while. And just take that to the hook point, and then we'll wind our thread back up to the spot where we tied in initially. And we're going to leave that space in the front, and we're just going to leave that so we can kind of visually gauge where we're going to form our head for the fly. So at this point, I don't need the white thread anymore, and I probably should have mentioned using the white thread because we have a translucent light material for the body, so we want to keep that light. We want to have a black head, so we're going to transfer to a 70D ultra thread, kind of keep things nice and small. We don't want to build up too much bulk. So basically, keeping that white thread as the underbody, that'll keep the pearl flashabou light colored. If we put a black underbody, it would really darken the final look of the body. So, I mean, you could do that if you like, and probably change the pattern a little bit. So we've just switched out our threads from our flat wax nylon to our black UTC 70D. Now we're going to start the body, and we're just going to grab all of those strands of flashabou. We just want to kind of flatten them out a little bit and make sure that they're wrapped tightly around the hook shank. And I just did one turn off of the thread base and then pull that onto the thread base. You do have to be careful when you're winding this on, especially at the back. That first turn is the most critical. If it's not, if all the strands aren't tight, you can get a little bit of loosening of the material, and it can kind of shred a little bit. So one thing that I like to do for that is just to add a little touch of either head cement, or in the case here, we're going to use a little bit of bone dry just to kind of add a little bit of durability to that and secure those Flashabou strands on the back. So just wound that into the head. We'll tie that off and trim off the excess. And as I said before, we're just going to take a dab of bone dry in this case. And I'm going to be using the bone dry, and you don't need a lot, just enough to kind of secure those fibers together. Just because we can zap it and dry it right away, we don't have to worry about leaving this for a dab of head cement to dry, so that we're not sticking any of the materials into wet cement. All right, so first we're going to start by tying a belly onto this fly. And for this, I like to use the bucktail that's near the tip. It tends to be a little finer in diameter, a little bit easier to work off. So we'll take a small amount, and we'll take this to the vise, and then we'll just start by kind of pulling out some of the longer fibers and getting rid of any of the really long ones, and then we'll kind of match those up. We kind of want to even the tips out without using a hair stacker. You can definitely use a hair stacker. I like a little bit more natural look to my bucktails, so I typically don't stack them because that just brings all the hairs into a really even line, and it kind of takes away from the natural look of the fly. So we'll just take a couple minutes and we'll just kind of hand sort those, and then we'll measure them. And you just have to have a little bit of practice transferring from hand to hand without messing up that neat cut. So we put that right in behind the eye, and I'm using fairly light wraps at first until I've got the bucktail position where I want it. And once I have it in a spot that looks pretty good, I'm going to eventually tighten my thread wraps. You can give that a bit of a wiggle just to make sure that all the fibers settle in. That looks pretty good. So we'll flip our hook over. If you don't have a rotary vise, I would suggest you take the hook out of the vise and flip it over to do that step. So next we're going to do the same thing with a bunch of orange hair. And this one doesn't matter where you take it from on the tail. And we're just going to take about the same amount. And again, we're going to just pull out those longest fibers and we're going to stack them back. And we'll just do this until we're happy with the results. And for the first wing here, we're going to make it just a touch longer than we have the belly. And one thing I like to do with this is just tie that in with a couple different sections. So you can see there I've got a bit of separation on the first wrap and the second wrap. So that kind of helps lock that hair a little better in place. Now we're just going to take a minute to adjust that before we commit that with a few more thread wraps. And then we're just going to add a couple more thread wraps, and we're not going to go crazy on that because we got a few more materials to add in here. First up, we're going to add a little bit of accent flash, and for this I'm just using a little bit of pearl crystal flash. I'm going to take 2 strands and I'll fold those in half and split those, and then I'm going to tie those right on top of the first wing. We're going to match the length on the wing with the crystal flash, and we'll just use a couple wraps. We want to make sure that the crystal flash ends up on top of the hook shank. Now it looks pretty good, so we'll go ahead and commit that with a few more wraps. We'll trim off the excess on the front. And next we're going to add a second or third wing material, I guess. And this is a red squirrel or a fox squirrel. And again, we're going to take a small cutting of the hair. And we're going to not really have to worry too much about aligning the tips of this, because the squirrel, the tips are aligned fairly well when you cut it off the tail. So the only thing we really want to do is kind of pull out any of the short hairs on the bottom, and then we'll trim that to length. And again, we'll kind of try and keep it in line with the orange in the wing. So we'll just add one loose wrap and kind of adjust things, and then we'll add a couple more wraps just to commit that. And again, when you're adding these wraps, you want to start light and then gradually add pressure. If you add really tight wraps to especially the bucktail, it will tend to flare quite a bit. So next we're going to take a few strands of peacock herl. And if you've been watching the channel for a while, you'll know I like to use peacock straight off the eye sticks. So we're going to take about 7 or 8 peacock herls. We just want to kind of make sure that the tips are more or less aligned here. We'll lay those right on top. And then again, we're going to add a couple wraps of threads. And then you just want to make sure that those are lined up properly before you really commit to all those thread wraps. Trim off the excess. And then we're going to take a minute and we're going to just give that a little final inspection. Make sure everything's fairly well lined up. And then we're going to start to create our tapered head. So for a bucktail, I like to have a little bit of a large head, and that kind of accommodates putting on the painted eyes for this. So typically, you don't want to go too large. I'm usually applying my paint with a toothpick, and so you want to go maybe twice the diameter of a toothpick, somewhere around that, just to eyeball that. And this is a size 4 hook we're tying on, so if you're tying smaller, of course you want to adjust to that. We'll add a whip finish here, and we're just going to keep our whip finish knot to the back because we want to maintain that taper. And we'll trim off our thread. So we're going to create a nice base to put our painted eyes on. So what I usually do, I'll do this in stages, but we're just going to add a coat of bone dry to the head. And if you don't have bone dry, my second choice would be a coat of clear Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails, and give that ample time to dry. If you're tying a bunch of these flies, you can do it in stages. So you can tie the fly and put a coat of cement on there, and do say a half dozen or so. Set them aside, and really you want to give them enough time to cure. So if you're using a head cement, I like to give it 3 or 4 hours for it to cure before I start adding the painted eyes. So for the eyes, we're going to be using a yellow with a black pupil. And for this, I use any sort of craft paint, works fine. And I'll just show you how I prepare the toothpick here. So for the black side, I just cut a little bit off the tip of that, and for the yellow side, the larger side, I cut it pretty much the whole. If you need to, you can take a little bit of sandpaper or rough surface just to kind of take off any burrs before you dip that into the paint. So I just dip the fat end into some of the yellow paint, and we'll just carefully apply that. And I usually use my finger to kind of steady myself. And I'll do both sides at the same time. So you want to kind of dip your toothpick in between just so you have a good coverage of paint. And again, this is something you can do in stages. So if you've done a half dozen flies, you can let the heads dry and then apply all the paint at the same time. Now we've let a bit of time elapse here, and now we're going to apply the pupil, and for that we're just going to use a little bit of black, and we're going to use the smaller diameter side of the toothpick for that. And again, we'll just make sure that we've let the yellow paint dry before we apply that. And then after we've let the black paint dry, we'll give it one more coat of bone dry or head cement just to kind of seal that paint in there. Alright, well, I hope you enjoyed this pattern. Make sure you check out my accompanying pattern, the Gerich Special. I'll put a link to it in the cards and in the description. You can always check out the recipe for the fly in the description below. Hey fly tyers, thanks for stopping by and checking out my fly tying videos. If you enjoyed the video and want to show your support, hit the thumbs up and share it to your social networks. I hope you consider subscribing to the channel, and if you do, be sure to hit the bell icon to get notifications on my latest fly patterns, tips, and reviews. If you have a question or comment, leave a message below. You'll also be entered into the next draw for some of the flies I tie and a few stickers. Until next time, this is Darren saying, keep a hook in your vise. Cheers.